Hello, welcome to American Baker in Germany. I'm Michelle, and today we are making a farewell cake for a family that I know who are moving away. And I've been very good friends with this family the entire time they've been in Germany. They're from England, but the party we are planning for them is going to be rather large, so we needed to make a large cake. So I'm making a two-tiered cake, and I'm decorating it with all sorts of things that I think of when I think of this family. If they have a cat, for example, I'm going to do my very best to model their cat as a topper. And I know they have struggled with some language a little bit, and they like some of the German words, so I'm going to put some of them on there. A couple of flags, places they've been, a couple of pictures, like little figures of things that I think of when I think of them. So it is probably one of those cakes that nobody else in the world would really care about having, but it is just a mishmash of all the things I think of when I think of this family. So hopefully that there is something for everyone on this cake somewhere, and that you can take something away from this. But this is something I was really excited to make for this family because they have been very good friends to me and to my children, and I'm going to miss them very much. So this is for you. And let's get started.
I start out with the cat topper and make it a couple of days beforehand. Here's an actual picture of their cat. I set the photo aside where I can refer to it later. I make the cat out of white gum paste. I have a really hard time describing how I model something, but I'll do my best. I start out focusing on the stature of the cat. I tried to get the rounded back that cats have. Right now, the head and neck are just one column off to the side. When I'm happy with the back, I use a pointed sculpting tool to separate the front legs from the back legs. The back legs of a cat are very distinctive, so I knew it would already start to look like a cat if I got the back legs right. Cat legs have a kind of diagonal indent to the front. I press this in with a fondant tool. This pointed sculpting tool is my best friend when sculpting this cat. I pressed my fingers into the back to separate the legs into two. I used my sculpting tool again to separate the front legs into two. I used my fingers to roll the front legs into thinner logs. I didn't want to make them too small, however, because I would be sacrificing some stability. Next, I worked on the head. This is another distinctive cat feature. I pointed the head a bit, but not to a sharp point, kind of a rounded point. I pressed my finger to create a slight indent where the eyes will go. I split the ears apart with my finger and pinched them into pointed ears. I used a ball tool to press in some eye sockets and to make slightly more pronounced ears. I pressed under the jawline a touch to make the neck more distinct from the head. Then I fussed over it a bit until I was happy with how it looked. I also pressed a fondant tool onto the back feet to make them distinct from the legs. I use a sharp sculpting tool to separate the toes apart on the front and the back paws. Then I roll a log of gum paste and cut it about the right length to be the cat's tail. I stuck it on with edible glue. Finally, this is a long-haired cat, so I took my pointed fondant tool and scratched some fur texture into the cat. After I was happy with the sculpted cat topper, I set it aside to dry. Word to the wise, make it earlier than 2 days before. It wasn't completely dry when I put it on the cake. Maybe 4 or 5 days before you need it. To prepare the cake to be tiered, I made a cake board for the top tier out of old cardboard cut to size and covered in tin foil. If you want a full tutorial on how to tier a cake, click the link in the eye. Then I filled and frosted my vanilla cake with chocolate buttercream. This is Swiss meringue buttercream with some dark chocolate folded in. After crumb coating the cake, I chilled it in the fridge for half an hour to set up. I got out my favorite gold cake board. Because the gold glitter paper is just craft paper and not food safe, I have to cover the board in plastic wrap to prepare it for the cake. Forgive the 5-year-old photobomber. Now I stack the bottom tier. This is 10-inch vegan chocolate cake filled and frosted with cookie butter buttercream. This is a recipe of Swiss meringue buttercream with a cup or so of cookie butter folded into it. It's my friend's favorite. I chill the cake just like the other tier. Then I got the top tier back out of the fridge and frosted it again with chocolate buttercream and chilled it again. Then I frosted the bottom tier with cookie butter buttercream. I cleaned up the cake board with a damp rag. I rolled out a large piece of pink fondant. Why pink fondant? There were 2 reasons for the pink. The first tiered cake I ever made was a 3-tier monster of a cake that was completely covered in pink fondant. It was for this family's oldest daughter's epic princess birthday party, and the mother of the family sometimes dyes her hair pink. Hence, pink had to be on the cake. I measured the fondant to make sure it was large enough, picked it up with my fondant rolling pin, and draped it over the cake. I smoothed it on with my fondant smoother in my hands, cutting off the excess with a sharp knife. I pressed the bottom lip of fondant into the cake and trimmed the rest carefully with the flat of the knife. Then I smoothed the sides one more time with the fondant smoother to make sure they were very straight. Then I chilled this tier while working on the top tier. The top tier I wanted to cover in a cheetah or leopard pattern. Ask the experts which this is, although I think it's cheetah. Why cheetah? Their oldest daughter loves leopard print and everything similar, and her mother even learned how to paint it onto fondant for her birthday cake. I started out with a piece of white fondant that I colored with ivory gel food coloring. This fondant was quite sticky, so I used some powdered sugar to keep it from sticking to my hands and work surface. The color was just too subtle though, so I added some brown fondant to make it a bit more light brown. I was much happier with it afterwards. Then I rolled the fondant to relatively thick, maybe 1/4 of an inch. I paused here and rolled a bunch of black snakes and wound them around themselves, laying them on the fondant in a semi-random pattern. The pattern didn't have to go all the way to the edge because I knew I would be trimming off the bottom after covering the tier. I rolled the fondant out a bit thinner, which also gave the pattern a bit more of a random look, and embedded the black snakes into the fondant really well. Then I carefully picked up the fondant with my fondant rolling pin and draped it over the cake. I smoothed the fondant onto the cake carefully, cutting off the excess with a sharp knife. I cut the bit of black fondant out of the excess and saved the rest as ivory fondant. Then I pressed the fondant into the sides of the cake and trimmed off the last lip at the bottom. I have to say I was happy there wasn't more than one small hole in the pattern that could be easily covered up. Now it's time to tier the cake. I got the bottom tier out of the fridge and cut some pieces of shashlik skewers the right length to fit into the cake. Then I placed them in a circular formation in the bottom tier. I dabbed some buttercream on the top and placed the top tier over the skewers. I cleaned up some stray chocolate buttercream with a dry towel. I chilled the cake while working on the decorations. I decided the cat needed some color. I pulled up the picture of their cat on my phone to reference while painting. I decided to start with the eyes. I discovered that the cat has light green eyes, but I started with black fondant. I rolled it really thin and cut out a few circles with a piping tip. Then I used the same piping tip to cut out some light green fondant and pressed it onto the black circles. Only a tiny rim of black was visible around the eyes. I shaped them into the cat eye shape with a bit of the knife. Then I glued them into the eye sockets with edible glue. Then I rolled a bit of black fondant into snakes and trimmed them to sides and added them on to the cat's vertical pupils. Then I cut out a tiny triangle of light pink fondant and formed a nose out of it. Now it's time for painting. I made some edible paint out of ivory and brown food coloring thinned down with clear alcohol. I tested the colors on a piece of stray white fondant. I started with the shadows with brown paint. Then I went back over the majority of the entire cat with ivory. I only left a couple of small patches white. If you like what we do here, consider subscribing for a new cake video every Monday, as well as regular bonus videos with recipes and baking basics. I felt that the paint was just a bit dark, so I used a paper towel to dab off a bit of the color in places. Then I painted on his mouth with brown. I was really happy with the way the cat turned out. I set him aside to allow the paint to dry. Now I'm using a soccer ball silicone mold to make a soccer ball. The whole family are big soccer fans. I pressed a few pieces of black fondant into the pentagons of the mold. Then I dabbed a bit of edible glue over the black fondant and pressed in a larger piece of white to fill the mold the rest of the way. I trimmed off the excess with a sharp knife and pulled the silicone away from the fondant to turn it out. I use a medieval silicone mold to make a castle out of gray. They lived in a renovated castle while here. I love the amount of detail in the mold, even if it was a bit small. Next, I made a couple of flags, beginning with England because they're from England. I started out cutting a white fondant square and trimming it to be a rectangle. Then I rolled out some red fondant and cut out a square, cutting the corners away with the same square cutter to form the cross. I stuck it onto the white rectangle with edible glue and trimmed off the overhang. And of course, I had to have a German flag. I cut out the rectangle of black fondant and cut a third of it away. Then did the same thing with red, sticking them together with edible glue. and finally, again, with yellow fondant. I rolled them together a bit to help them stick together better and trimmed them back down to size. I decided that of all things, they had to have a yellow car on the cake. They drove a yellow Nissan while here, which they had to sell when they left. So I looked up a picture of the exact car that they drove and cut out the shape out of yellow fondant. I cut the general shape first and then cut the wheels out with the back of a piping tip. And sticking on the back wheels with edible glue. Then I cut out the shape of the windows out of black fondant. I stuck it on with edible glue, but I had to trim it a bit since it was a bit long. I added a few details on the door with the back of a knife. The wheels did not want to stick on. Then I looked up a picture of a jet and freehand cut it out of some gray fondant. The family loves to travel. I cleaned up the edges with my knife and modeling tools. The family is also quite musical. The oldest, at least, takes piano lessons and the mother plays as well. I decided they needed some musical notes on the cake. I cut out some small circles out of black fondant with a round piping tip. Then I cut out a few squares of black fondant and cut out the center to make some eighth notes. Then, just for fun, I added an extra bar to make 16th notes. Then a couple freestanding eighth notes. And another couple eighth notes. Then I freehanded the general shape of a surfboard because they love to surf. This one was a bit abstract. They love track and field. I tried to make a finish line out of a stripe of white fondant. Next, I used a silicone press mold to form the letters to spell the German word Geschwindigkeitsbegrenzung, which means speed limit, but is such a long word that they laughed about this word for weeks after they learned it. Now let's put it all together. I start out placing the castle, then the two flags around the bottom tier. Then the musical notes. Then I cover the biggest gap in the cheetah pattern with the yellow car. Then I place the surfboard, soccer ball, jet, and finish line on the top tier. I carefully lay the long German word on the top of the bottom tier, wrapping it around the cake. It literally covered half the cake. Then I made the word Schultüte for the other side, which is another favorite German word. I decided I needed something for the bottoms of the tiers. I cut out 2 different sized flowers out of all rainbow colored fondant except green, because I don't see too many green flowers. This family is a colorful family, nothing boring about them. Then I placed the daisies around the bottom tier in rainbow order. Then I did the same thing with the smaller flowers around the top tier. Finally, I placed the cat on top. My friends loved this cake at the farewell party. I was able to give them the cat topper to take home. I really feel like this cake represents what I think of when I think of this lovely family. There is only a piece or two left from the whole cake at the party. We'll miss you, wonderful people. Keep in touch.